Pro. I get excited every year Apple announce a brand new iPad Pro, and this year is no different. Most of the changes are actually not even visual this year, but it's all about what's happening on the inside, because this year's iPad Pro, both the 11-inch and the 12.9-inch that I have behind me, are powered by Apple's much loved M1 chipset. This is the Apple Silicon chipset that we've seen do wonders on the MacBook range, and now it's in the iPad Pro range of tablets. And I'm going to talk more about the performance later on in this video, but in terms of visuals, like starting off using last year's iPad Pro, which is in space gray, and this year's iPad Pro in silver, other than the color difference side by side, it's very difficult to tell if there are any differences. The only way that you will notice this year's iPad Pro is that it does feel slightly heavier and look slightly thicker. And that's really about what's happening on the display front, which again, I'll talk about in a moment. But from a design perspective, it's still a really, really good looking design. It's industrial, it's got this nice mixture of metal and glass, and it feels incredibly premium in the hand. This 12.9-inch still requires some getting used to if you're not used to it. But for me personally, coming from an 11-inch iPad Pro, I much prefer the screen real estate with a 12.9-inch. Now, I normally go with like darker colors like the space gray, but this year's iPad Pro in silver, I think matches perfectly with the brand new Magic Keyboard, which came in white. Now, in terms of functionality, the Magic Keyboard hasn't changed from last year's, but this white color is really, really nice. And you know, if you've been on the fence about whether or not a Magic Keyboard is worth that extra money, I cannot recommend this highly enough. I think the Magic Keyboard really does give you a much better typing experience. And now that iPad OS has that support for the cursor, it is also very, very good for that. But in terms of this combo, this silver with the white Magic Keyboard, I think it looks really, really nice. I have to mention though, as far as this white color is concerned, I've babied this as much as I can, but I don't know if you can tell over here, it still will pick up kind of discoloration and not discoloration per se, but more like smudges. So you've got to really baby this. And if you suffer from OCD, yeah, might want to reconsider that white color. Will the newer iPad Pro work with the older Magic Keyboard? Well, initially, there was some confusion about compatibility. Strictly speaking, it's not compatible, but in terms of working, yes, if you've got an older Magic Keyboard, it will work with that. The only thing that you will notice is that when you close it, it is a little more snug, and that's because the newer iPad Pro is slightly thicker. Now, when it comes to the display, there is a difference this year between the 11-inch and the 12.9-inch, because on the 12.9-inch, we get the brand new Liquid Retina XDR display. It is an absolutely stunning display. It's weird because the display day to day, you won't be able to tell a major difference if you were to compare it with last year's iPad Pro, but when you're playing games and viewing content, particularly HDR videos and HDR photos, that's where that display really pops, because you get these extreme dynamic range. You also get these deep, deep blacks that you would associate with an OLED display. Now, it isn't an OLED display that Apple are using. In fact, it's a mini LED display, but the effect that that has is still noticeable on this display. It's very, very nice. And in some ways, it might be Apple's kind of middle way between an LCD and an OLED display. And I think most people are going to really, really appreciate, particularly on this larger 12.9-inch, the newer display. Now, it is more brighter than the previous LCD display on the last year's iPad Pro. And you also get a peak brightness of 1600 nits. That's particularly when you're viewing HDR content. Now, the display is very nice, but there are some that have reported issues around blooming. Now, this is something that you might get with this type of technology on the display. And that's essentially when an area of the display has been lit up, but you get an area around it also being highlighted. And it almost looks like a haze or a blur. Yes, when you are in pitch black conditions, if you use your iPad in that situation, you will notice, like for example in the Notes app, the area around certain icons will be lit up. But that really depends on how you use your iPad. I know that some people might use their iPad in those kind of scenarios, so that's something to be aware of. My kids absolutely love the iPad Pro along with the Apple Pencil. They get some creative stuff done, and I think the two go really well together. So when I do get my iPad Pro and some peace and quiet, the iPad Pro is really, really useful to use not only at home, but if you're going to be using this out and about, then this year we also get 5G on the 11 and the 12.9-inch iPad Pro as an option. So that means, faster downloads, lower latency, better bandwidth. So if that's something that's important to you, then you'll be happy to know that that's available. Now, as far as cameras are concerned, so this has that dual camera, 12 megapixel wide and 10 megapixel ultra wide. And, people still use the iPad Pro to take photos, and it does a really good job at taking both photos and videos. But on that dual camera on the back, we also have a Lidar scanner or Lidar scanner. This is something that I don't particularly use, but it is quite useful for certain applications, for augmented reality. And there's a really cool app called Clips, and that is a fun app that uses the augmented reality along with the Lidar scanner. Now, the big update is actually on the front this year because we have a 12 megapixel ultra wide on the Face ID camera module. And one of the features here is the fact that it's got something called center stage. Now, it works with that 12 megapixel ultra wide. It also works with machine learning. And check this out. As I move around, it will keep me center stage. It works really, really well. It works currently for Zoom, FaceTime, and this means that it is, it keeps everybody in shot basically. So you'll be happy to know that this now supports a Thunderbolt. So if you've got any peripherals, you can actually plug this in and take advantage of that. The other thing is battery life. Pretty solid battery life, like between 8 to 10 hours, depending on what applications I'm using. So anything that's sort of high intensity applications like Lumia Fusion or sort of HDR content for prolonged periods of time, that will bring the battery life down. But generally speaking, pretty solid battery life for this. So I talked earlier on about the M1 chip, and let's face it, the iPad Pro, even last year's iPad Pro, wasn't exactly slow. The thing that really confuses me this year is that Apple putting the M1 chip with the 8-core GPU, the 8-core CPU, and then if you get one of the 1 or 2 terabyte capacity variations, getting 16 GB of RAM, that's telling us more about the future of the iPad Pro than it is right now. Because let's face it, this thing right now feels overqualified for the job. iPadOS, the iPad has never been in need of power or performance necessarily. It does a very good job. I mean, I use this for Lumia Fusion, 4K, 60 frames per second editing. This thing doesn't even build up a sweat. It does a consistently good job. Even if I'm using this for office work with multiple apps, or if I'm doing photo editing with Affinity, I've never had an issue with performance on the iPad Pro. So getting this year's iPad Pro with the M1 chip, with 16 GB of RAM, it's probably telling us, now that we're only a few days away by the time you're watching this video, to WWDC. And this is where I'm most excited, because I can't believe that Apple would do all this work for an iPad Pro without giving us something. It's really weird, because one of the cardinal rules of a tech reviewer is that never recommend a product based on what it might be, but always recommend it based on what it is today. Like right now, today, if you're thinking about buying an iPad Pro, and yes, let's say you've got an older iPad Pro, not last year's iPad Pro, but a year before, then yeah, I mean, it might be worth picking this up. But I really think we're gonna see this shine after WWDC. The iPad OS on this is the only thing in my kind of experience that is pulling the iPad Pro down. The iPad OS has improved considerably, and it gives you much more than we have expected in the past when it comes to access and control. The multi-window use, the multitasking use of this is actually quite good, and I'm quite happy with a lot of that. I know some people would like to see even more, but generally speaking, it does a good job in that department. But the OS still feels like it is limiting the iPad Pro's capabilities, and that's something that I've really keeping my fingers crossed for. I hope we get to see more from iPad OS in WWDC. that's living with the iPad Pro. And let me know what you think of this year's iPad Pro in the comments down below. And I want you to also tell me what you think of this entire video that was shot using an iPhone 12 Pro Max. Now I've got this other video that I want you to check out over here. I'll see you over there next.